"I can't live without a man," said the giant woman left alone. The rancher let her stay. That's what the townsfolk whispered, shaking their heads at the sight of her towering frame on the edge of his land, clutching nothing but a torn shawl and a hope too big to bury. She wasn't just large in body, she was large in sorrow, large in need. They said she'd been driven out, cursed by her size, her softness mistaken for weakness. But the man she found wasn't the kind to turn a woman away, not when she'd already been broken by so many. Was she foolish to believe a stranger's porch could be her salvation? And why would a rancher known for silence take in a woman who couldn't hide? By dawn, he'd let her stay. By dusk, the whole town would talk. But only they knew the truth, and it wasn't what anyone expected. When a woman's cry echoes louder than the canyon wind, and a man's silence holds the weight of his past, one question remains. Who showed mercy that day, and who finally found home? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how these stories tie us together, across borders, burdens, and belief. If you still believe in decency, grit, and grace, then you belong in this story too. Tell me which state you're watching from, and subscribe so we can keep sharing the kind of tales that matter. They said she was born too big for this world, too long in the limbs, too loud in the lungs, too strange in the face. Her mother, a quiet woman of church and sewing circles, used to say Agnes was simply blessed with more of everything. But when the old woman passed, no one left in the Harlow house remembered to call it a blessing. Her sister, Ruth, stood over the coffin with a mouth like a blade and eyes full of disdain, and by the end of the week, Agnes had been handed a carpet bag, a half-eaten loaf of bread, and a final command. Go on. You're too much for this home. She didn't cry. Not then. She only nodded, stepped off the porch that had known her since girlhood, and began walking west, into nowhere. There was no inheritance, no invitation. Her father had died in a railroad accident years prior, and the man who once promised marriage vanished after one Sunday picnic when he'd caught sight of how her shadow dwarfed his own. Since then, Agnes had lived in corners, too large to disappear, but always trying to. Now, with blistered heels and sunburned cheeks, she moved like a forgotten wagon wheel over the Kansas prairie. Her boots had split open. Her petticoats were stained with clay and tears. Tucked inside her satchel was her mother's locket, a small, round silver piece with a hinge that stuck and no photograph inside. She'd meant to place one there, never had the chance. The other object was a small Bible with curled pages and a cracked spine, given to her on her 8th birthday. The binding was soft now from how often her fingers returned to the same verses. Blessed are the meek, the last shall be first. God seeth not as man seeth. By the time the land began to rise and the sky took on that wide, unforgiving blue of Wyoming territory, Agnes no longer counted the days. She followed the riverbeds, the fence lines, the sound of crows. Each night she slept with her back to a rock or a tree, whispering aloud to no one in particular. Her voice was deep and gentle, like wind through a church door. I'm still here. That must mean something. The wind turned colder on the 4th day in Wyoming. Gray clouds piled in the distance, stacking like judgment. Her body ached in places she hadn't known could ache. Her shoulders stung from sun and strain. Still she pressed on, fueled by a rumor whispered at the edge of a trading post. Of a rancher in these parts who lived alone, who didn't speak, who never turned away, a soul in need. The locals called him Ghost or Grizzly, depending on the weather. But one old trapper had looked her square in the eyes and said, "If anyone will let you rest, it's him." That had been enough. The hills sloped downward then, and she followed a broken fence line toward a distant shape. A barn, perhaps, or just a dream made solid by desperation. Rain began to spit from the sky, cold and sharp. The wind picked up. Her vision blurred. She made it as far as the last fence post. Then her knees buckled. Her hands broke her fall, but the earth was unforgiving, and she slumped to one side, the mud rising around her skirts. Her breath came shallow, her locket pressed into her ribs. She tried to rise, but the world turned sideways, and then all was still. From the barn's shadow beneath the eaves where the light couldn't reach, a man stood, tall, broad, unmoving, his eyes fixed on her collapsed figure with a gaze that saw far more than flesh. He said nothing. He did not move. Not yet. They called him the mute bull of Glory Mesa. Part man, part legend, all sorrow. Folks in town spoke of Silas Dorne with a mix of pity and dread, as if his silence might rub off on you if you stood too close. He hadn't set foot in the chapel since the coffin was lowered. Not his wife's, not his infant son's, both lost in the same cursed week 10 years back. Since then, he hadn't spoken a single word. Not to the blacksmith who shod his horses, not to the mail rider who left letters that never got read, not to the preacher who came once and never came back. His ranch sat wide and lonesome at the edge of the pines, a land stitched with worn fence and long grass. Silence was the law there, the kind of silence that weighed down on a man like snow on a cabin roof, cold, heavy, patient. Silas kept to himself, fed his stock, mended his own roof, split his own wood, and buried his grief deep beneath the floorboards. He needed no one. At least that's what he told himself. But when he saw her, the large woman slumped in the mud beside his fence post, her dress soaked, her breath like fog on glass. Something moved in him, not a word, not a thought he could name, just a deep pull, like a draft through a room sealed too long. Without a sound, he stepped from the barn, his boots sinking into the wet ground. He knelt beside her, one hand to her shoulder. Warm, but fading. Her face was flushed with fever, lips chapped, lashes thick with dust. She stirred faintly but didn't wake. He lifted her easily like a sack of oats, though her frame was near as tall as his own. He didn't flinch. She weighed nothing to a man who'd carried sorrow for a decade. His arms held her steady as he walked her into the cabin. Inside, the hearth already glowed with a low amber flame. He laid her gently on the cot near the fire, pulled a wool blanket over her, and stepped back. For a moment, he just watched her, the rise and fall of her chest, the twitch of her fingers, the way her jaw set even in sleep like someone accustomed to being stared at too long. He made a broth from potatoes and marrow bones, let it simmer, then cooled it in a tin cup. When her eyes blinked open some hours later, they landed first on the ceiling, then the fire, then him. She didn't scream. She only looked. Her voice when it came was hoarse but whole. "Where am I?" He didn't answer, just knelt beside the fire and offered her the tin. She drank, slow, careful sips. Then she looked at him again, eyes narrowing. "You live here?" He nodded. "Alone?" Another nod. She glanced toward the door, rain still falling outside, tapping gently like a second heartbeat. "Can I stay? Just for the night?" He looked at her a long while. His face didn't change, but his eyes held something. Not pity, not fear, just stillness. He nodded once, then turned away and added more wood to the fire. The first morning Agnes tried to stand. Her legs trembled beneath her weight, stiff from days of walking and nights curled against the hard earth. She braced herself on the edge of the table, then sat back down quickly when the chair beneath her gave a low, aching groan. It wasn't broken, but the sound had a voice, one she'd heard all her life. Too much, too heavy, too big. She glanced around to see if he noticed. Silas was pouring oats into a kettle, his back to her, unmoved. She exhaled quietly. The cabin was small but orderly, built by a hand that understood structure and silence. A single mirror hung near the door, warped at the edges and no taller than her chest. She caught her reflection in it once, later that day, and froze. Mud still streaked her skirt, her collar sat crooked, and her arms, large and solid, stretched her sleeves too tight. She tried not to look again after that, yet Silas didn't seem to see what she saw. He never winced when she reached for something, never sighed when her shadow fell across the room. Once she caught her sleeve on the edge of the hearth and spilled a bucket of kindling. She scrambled to gather the scattered sticks, cheeks burning with apology, but he just knelt and helped, wordless, steady, as though nothing had gone wrong. That evening she noticed something new, a bench, wider and sturdier than the two chairs at the table. It hadn't been there before. The wood was freshly sanded, the nails still shining. Placed near the fire, it welcomed her without a sound. He didn't mention it, didn't look at her when she sat on it, but she knew. The next day she insisted on helping. He handed her a feed bucket without argument. She followed him to the goat pen, where she met the animals, all shaggy and obstinate, like him. She laughed once when one head-butted her thigh, and when she turned, Silas was watching her, a strange softness in his eyes. Not amusement, not affection exactly. Something quieter. Recognition, maybe. She fixed a squeaky barn gate with wire and patience, hauled water from the well with both hands, gritting her teeth through the ache, swept the front porch and rubbed balm into a limping dog's paw. Each night she returned to her place by the fire. He always made sure it was lit before she came in. Sometimes she talked, not in grand speeches, just fragments. My mama used to say God painted the sky different for those with sore hearts. Or, there was a boy once, too thin for me, but he said I reminded him of a hill. I didn't know if it was meant kindly. Silas never responded, not aloud, but he listened, always. One night as she settled into the bench he built for her, she sighed into the firelight and whispered, "You can't shrink what God made tall." I tried. She didn't know if he heard that part, but the next morning she found a folded blanket waiting on her bench, and beside it, a tin cup already filled with warm tea. She wasn't snooping. That's what Agnes told herself, though her cheeks flushed all the same when her hand brushed something soft and papered in the drawer of the old sideboard. She'd been dusting, trying to earn her place through work instead of presence, as if quiet chores could cancel out the noise her body made simply by existing in a world too small for it. The drawer had stuck a little, swollen by age, and when she tugged it open, the scent of cedar and thyme had spilled out. That's when she saw them, a small bundle of letters, bound in twine as brittle as dried grass. The handwriting was neat, careful, a man's hand, a man trying not to shake. She picked up the top one. No envelope, just a folded page with the words, "Clara, my heart breaks with the morning light." She didn't read further. The name alone was heavy enough. Beneath it, another, to Abigail, who I held for only moments. The paper was smudged as if the ink had blurred before it dried, and the last thick with creases and written in a larger, uneven hand. To my son I never met. Agnes held it delicately, as if it might dissolve from the warmth of her palm. These weren't just letters. They were grief bound in script, sorrow etched into silence. She heard the door open. Cold air swept in, followed by boots heavy on the wood. Silas stood there, his eyes falling not on her, but on the letter in her hand. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, as always. He only looked at her, then turned, walked past without a sound. The door closed behind him with a dull thud. Agnes placed the letters back carefully, retied the twine as best she could, and closed the drawer. She stood in the quiet of the room, her breath loud in her ears, her heart uncertain. Snow had begun to fall outside, soft and slow, like ash after a fire. The day passed without his return. She fed the goats, boiled potatoes, kept the fire alive, all in silence. Nightfall came. The wind tapped on the windows, and she sat on her bench, arms wrapped around her middle, staring into the flames. Then the door opened. Silas stepped in, snow clinging to his coat, his hat held against his chest. In his hand was a single lily, pale as moonlight, petals tight from the cold. He walked to the hearth and placed it down gently, as one might lay a child into sleep. Then he looked at her and nodded. That was all. He moved to the other chair and took his place, his boots drying by the fire. She didn't speak, neither did he, but something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not explanation, just a knowing. That night, for the first time, she opened the old leather-bound book she'd kept tucked in her satchel. Not the Bible, but a journal, blank until now. She dipped a pen into ink and began to write. Not to anyone, just to herself. The wind here sounds different, like it's carrying old stories instead of warnings. The man still doesn't speak, but I think he's listening. I fed the goats today. One licked my hand. I didn't flinch. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a ghost with skin. She closed the book softly, placed it beneath her pillow, and turned toward the fire. The lily still sat where he'd left it, not blooming yet, but not wilting either. In the town of Glory Mesa, nothing traveled faster than gossip. Not the stagecoach, not the wind, not even fire. And when that gossip had shape and name, it took root like burrs in wool. The news came in murmurs first, whispered between sacks of flour and bins of nails. The mute ranchers taken in a woman, a big one. By noon the words were sharper, louder. The general store clerk, a wiry man with a fondness for exaggeration, said she'd bought enough beans to feed a cavalry, claimed she drank coffee from a soup bowl and cracked the seat on Silas Dorne's only chair. Eats like a mule, he declared, loud enough for the young boys near the barrels of rock candy to snicker behind their hands. The preacher's wife, tight-laced and shrill as a teapot, pursed her lips in judgment. It's indecent, she said. A man and a woman under one roof with no vows nor preacher's blessing. God sees what goes on in silence. Children laugh behind fences, mocking the sway of a heavy step, lifting their arms high in pantomime of a woman too large for their understanding. They called her names she would never hear, but names that stuck like splinters in the town's skin. But not everyone joined the chorus. Old Hattie Quinn, the midwife whose hands had delivered more babies than anyone could count, sat quiet on her porch, rocking slow, eyes narrowed to the horizon. When asked what she thought of it, of her, she only said, "Let's see what God makes of it before we judge. Folks forget, miracles don't always come in small packages." Back at the ranch, the fire crackled like always. The goats bleated for feed, the wind tugged at the shutters, and Agnes hummed beneath her breath as she patched a sleeve in the sunlit doorway. She didn't know about the talk, not yet. She didn't know the way her name was being twisted by mouths that never once called her by it. What she did know was this: her left boot had a hole. She hadn't said anything, just kept walking with the limp of a woman too used to making do. But one morning she found the boot by the hearth, mended clean, the leather stitched in quiet, even rows. No note, no comment, just the work done. She slipped it on and it fit better than it ever had. Later that day, while sweeping the front stoop, she caught sight of Silas watching her from the barn door. Something in her chest fluttered. "I ever tell you," she called out, brushing a curl from her face, "that I once tried to ride a draft horse side saddle? Saddle split in half." She laughed, sudden and full, and it startled the birds from the fence rail. A real laugh, round and rolling, not tucked behind her teeth. Silas didn't laugh with her, not aloud, But something softened in his face. The lines around his mouth curved. His eyes crinkled with a quiet light. He smiled. And that evening, when she sat on her wide bench with a cup of tea, the silence between them didn't feel so empty anymore. It felt full, full of things unsaid, but understood. Outside, the hills held the gossip like they held the snow. Only on the surface, where it mattered, the ground remained warm. The wind howled low that night, a strange kind of moan that wrapped around the cabin like a warning. Agnes stirred in her sleep, restless beneath the quilt, sensing something wasn't right. It wasn't just the wind. It was the silence beneath it, too hollow, too still. Then came the bleeding. Sharp, panicked, she sat up, heart racing. Through the window, she saw shadows moving along the edge of the pen. Goats pushing against the fence, then breaking free, scattering into the dark. The gate had come undone, or been undone. She grabbed her shawl and rushed out into the cold, boots crunching over frost. "Go on! Hush now! Come back!" she cried, her voice cutting through the night like a bell. One goat darted past her, another toward the trees. She could barely see their shapes, only the wildness in their movement. The cabin door slammed behind her. Silas emerged with a rifle already in hand, eyes sharp, movements purposeful. He didn't ask questions, didn't shout. He simply loaded a round, slung the strap over his shoulder, and motioned with a nod. One way for her, another for him. She moved quickly, heart pounding, breath fogging the air. She found two goats huddled by the woodpile, guided them back. Then she saw it. Near the fence line, where the moonlight touched the earth in a pale wash, the smallest goat, the one she'd named Pickle for its habit of wriggling into places it didn't belong, lay still on its side, too still. She froze, then stepped closer. The fur had been carved. A jagged line of letters slashed cruelly across its flank. "She don't belong." Her breath caught. Her knees gave. She fell to the ground beside the tiny creature, her hands trembling as they hovered above its lifeless body. The goat's eyes were wide open, still glossy, as if it hadn't understood what was happening until it was over. Agnes pressed both hands to her face, not in fear, not even in grief, but in something older. Shame, familiar, a message meant for her. Not whispered, not muttered behind hands in town, but written in blood and hide. She wept there alone, until she felt a coat placed over her shoulders and a warm hand at her back. Silas stood beside her, face set like stone. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His hand stayed there as long as she needed it. By morning she rose to find the fire already lit, the pen repaired, the goats fed. And on the kitchen table, wrapped in a folded square of soft cloth, sat a revolver. It wasn't polished for show. It was clean, used, oiled, meant for hands that had never held one before. She looked at it a long while, then looked at him. He stood near the door, watching her with that same still gaze. No instruction, no demand, only the truth of it. "This is yours if you want to stay." Agnes touched the weapon gently, then folded the cloth back over it. She didn't thank him aloud, didn't cry again, but for the first time she felt something new coil beneath her ribs. Not fear, not helplessness, readiness. The night had come down hard, full of wind that slid through the pines like a warning. The sky above was cloudless, the stars sharp as needles. Inside the cabin, the fire popped and settled into a deep, steady glow. Agnes sat on her bench near the hearth, mending a torn sleeve by lamplight. Her stitches were neat, practiced, fingers trained by need, not craft. Across from her, Silas sat in the old wooden rocker he'd made years ago, boots planted firm, eyes on the flames. Neither had spoken in hours. It was the sort of silence Agnes had come to expect in the evenings. comfortable, unspoken. Still, something in the air felt different tonight, not colder, just heavier. Her needle paused for a moment, then carried on. The rhythm of thread and cloth filled the space between them. Silas exhaled slowly, eyes still fixed forward. And then, in a voice that sounded as though it hadn't been used in years, dry, low, and steady, he said, "Her name was Clara." The words sat there, full of weight and memory, floating above the fire like smoke. Agnes didn't move. She didn't look up, only nodded once and let her thread pull clean through. She tied off the stitch and reached for the next seam, giving him space not with distance, but with patience. He said nothing more that night. But over the next few days, the past began to slip out in pieces, like thaw from a snowbank. He spoke in the morning sometimes, just a word or two over coffee. Other times it was late at night, when he thought she'd gone to sleep. She never asked, never pressed, never turned toward him too quickly. She just kept moving, feeding the goats, kneading bread, sweeping the porch, letting the weight of his words settle where they would. Clara had been his wife, small, sharp-tongued, full of light. She'd painted the walls with flowered vines and laughed like bells in spring. He told Agnes how Clara would sing to the chickens, how she wanted 5 children, how she loved storms. Their child, unnamed, unheld, had come too early, born in blood and silence. Clara died 3 days later, wrapped in sweat and fever, and the sound of her own name slipping from his lips like prayer. He'd sold off half the land to bury them properly, bought a marble headstone from a man in Laramie who'd looked at him with pity and offered a discount he didn't want. After that, the words left him, not from anger, just emptiness. Agnes listened through all of it, her eyes calm, her hands never idle. She wiped dishes dry with a steady rhythm, mended fence posts, sliced potatoes, always near, never in the way. Silas noticed the way she never filled the silence with her own stories, never tried to match pain for pain. She didn't turn his sorrow into a mirror for hers. She let it breathe, let it belong to him. And in that quiet, something true was being built between them, layer by layer, grain by grain, like wood meeting wood in a joint well crafted, strong not from force, but from fit. Ezekiel Harlow arrived in Glory Mesa on a crisp autumn morning, his coat clean, his boots polished, and his hat tilted with practiced ease. The stagecoach dust hadn't even settled before he was shaking hands with the sheriff and tipping his hat to the preacher's wife, flashing a smile carved out of confidence and snake oil. Folks took to him quick enough. He had the kind of face that made people trust what they ought to question, and the kind of voice that curled around truth like ivy on a dying fence post. He called himself a railroad man now, come west to handle land acquisitions, but it didn't take long before the real reason for his visit slipped into the town's ears. "Poor Agnes," he'd say, with a sympathetic grimace over a mug of black coffee. "She was never quite right, bless her heart. Heart, big spirit, but liable to act out. Dangerous, if I'm being honest." He paused just long enough to let the words sit, then sighed. "We did all we could back home, but sometimes you just can't help folks who won't help themselves." By midweek, the story had twisted itself into something nearly unrecognizable. That she'd gone north uninvited, that the mute rancher had been tricked, that the land she was squatting on had once belonged to her family and now, by some misunderstanding, was being occupied without rightful claim. Ezekiel walked into the county clerk's office 2 days after his arrival and filed a petition for land reassessment. On paper, it looked legitimate. The half of the Dorne property sold years ago to cover burial costs had never been formally documented with the updated survey lines. The purchaser had been a traveling cattleman who died in Montana without ever recording the transfer. Silas had used the land, repaired it, lived on it, but legally, the title was blurred in bureaucratic shadow. And Ezekiel, slick as oil, was trying to slide right into that shadow. The town buzzed. Old men at the feed store muttered about property rights. The preacher's wife nodded grimly and clutched her Bible tighter. But not everyone believed the tale so quick. Hattie Quinn didn't speak much when she heard the rumor. She only pursed her lips, adjusted her shawl, and began asking questions. Quietly, purposefully. She'd seen Agnes with her own eyes, heard the calm in her voice and the steadiness in her hands. Whatever Ezekiel said, it didn't match the woman she'd met. And if there was one thing Hattie trusted more than her instincts, it was her memory. She rode out to the courthouse in the next town over to review property filings, stopped by the cemetery to revisit an old deed, watched and waited. Back at the ranch, Silas didn't speak of the rumors, didn't mention the visit to town or the whispers that had begun drifting up the hill like smoke from a fire not yet visible. But he took his axe from the shed and began sharpening it on the porch in the fading light. Slow, measured strokes. The sound echoed across the yard like a hymn sung through grit teeth. Agnes watched him from the doorway, a shadow in the lamplight, her face unreadable. The past had sent a man in boots with shiny buttons. But this time, neither she nor Silas planned to run. The knock came just after dawn, 3 quick raps against the cabin door, sharp and official. Agnes was pouring coffee, her hands steady until that sound reached the edges of her spine. Silas was already standing, boots on, eyes narrowed. He opened the door with a slow hand. A deputy stood there, hat in hand, gaze flicking from Silas to Agnes and back. He wasn't cruel, just uncomfortable. He handed over the folded packet of paper like it might burn his fingers. "Ma'am," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes, "you've been served. There's to be a hearing at the Glory Mesa Hall this Friday. Best you come with someone to speak for you." Agnes took the paper with both hands, her fingers brushing the rough ink, her name written in blocky letters at the top. Agnes Harlow, respondent. By noon, word had already spread. Ezekiel had filed a formal claim, demanding a reassessment of the land. But he didn't stop there. He brought with him 2 men, one a cousin by marriage she hadn't seen in 10 years, the other a hired man who claimed to know her from back east. They sat tall in the courtroom, hats off and faces smooth, lying with the kind of ease born from practice. They said Agnes had mental fits, that she'd once screamed in public and thrown a kettle, that she wandered without direction, that she'd seduced an old grieving man for land and security. Their words were slow and polite, carefully shaped to sound like concern, but soaked through with cruelty. "She's a large woman," one of them said, as if that proved something. "Hard to stop if she's in a mood." Agnes sat straight back in her chair, the room heavy with heat and judgment. The townsfolk filled the pews, some curious, some smirking, some too ashamed to look at her. But Silas sat beside her, still and solid as a stone wall. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone, his refusal to leave her side, sent unease crawling down the spines of those who dared to mock her. He folded his arms, boots planted wide, jaw locked. The men testifying wouldn't look at him, not directly. The judge, a tired man with ink-stained fingers and sharp eyes, listened without interruption. He glanced over the paperwork, then over the room. "Given the claim's age and the unclear ownership history," he said slowly, "I'm granting 1 week for a counterclaim to be filed. Bring evidence. If you can't, the eviction will be enforced by month's end." The gavel came down like thunder. Agnes stood, hands clenched tight at her sides. Her heart was pounding, legs shaky beneath her, but she held her chin high. Every step out of the courthouse echoed like a hammer on anvil. Outside, the sky had turned gray. Folks on the porch watched her pass, their glances sharp as stones. She didn't flinch, didn't look down. She walked like a woman who had something left to prove, not to them, to herself. It began with a question spoken in a corner booth of the general store, whispered by Hattie Quinn as she counted out coins for a sack of flour. "Tell me again who filed the deed," she said to the clerk, her voice light but her eyes keen. "And when exactly?" The man blinked, hesitated. "Ezekiel Harlow. Says he's got the paperwork straight from Topeka." "Hmm," Hattie said, slipping her change into her shawl. "Funny how paper travels faster than truth." She left without another word, but by afternoon she was seated at the blacksmith's kitchen table, a tattered map spread between them. Caleb Boone, a man of soot and brawn, squinted at the yellowed parchment. This was drawn up back when Silas's wife was still alive. Marked proper, shows his full acreage plain as day. He tapped a thick finger to a faded boundary line. Ezekiel's claim don't hold water unless you're willing to forget Clara Dorne ever lived. They weren't. Hattie gathered allies the way a fire gathers wind, quietly, steadily, without apology. Miss Ellen, the school marm with a spine of steel and a memory sharp enough to recall the full reading list of 1887, pulled birth and death records from the chapel's archives. She found Clara's name in faded ink beside a plot number, along with a donation Silas had made. Half the land, gifted to the church in her name, with no record of reversion. Even the livery boy, young Tom with more dust on his pants than years behind him, confessed he'd overheard Ezekiel boasting about taking back what's his before he even stepped foot in the courthouse. "Said he'd make her look unfit," Tom whispered, eyes wide, "so nobody'd question the rest." The proof stacked slowly, like logs before a fire. Piece by piece, the story turned. Then Sunday came, and the preacher, a usually soft-spoken man of thin sermons and thinner backbones, stood tall behind the pulpit and raised his voice. He didn't name names, but the message rang out clearer than a bell. "There are those among us," he said, "who twist the law to serve their pride, who sharpen words like knives and call it righteousness. But let me remind you, mercy and truth walk hand in hand in the eyes of the Lord, and a good man doesn't need to speak to be heard. Nor does a woman need permission to stand where she's been planted." The congregation sat still, shame spreading like frost across bowed heads. Later that day, the whispers began to change. The boys who once mocked Agnes's walk now shuffled their feet when she passed. A merchant left an extra loaf in Silas's cart without charging a cent. The blacksmith fixed her kettle for free. And when she crossed the town square with her shawl pulled tight against the wind, a few men tipped their hats instead of turning away. Not all were swayed. Some hearts harden before they bend. But the tide had shifted, and once a tide turns in Glory Mesa, even the mountains take notice. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the floorboards, the kind that reached across the room like arms trying to remember something once held. Agnes sat close to the hearth, her hands curled around a tin cup gone cold. Outside, the night was still, unnaturally so, as though the world itself was holding its breath for the morning to come. She hadn't spoken much that day. Neither had Silas. They'd worked the usual rhythm, fed the goats, chopped wood, repaired the back fence where the latch had begun to sag. But it all moved beneath a heavy hush. The hearing loomed like a storm you could smell long before the clouds rolled in. Even the animals seemed to sense it, staying near the barn, eyes wide, ears twitching at nothing. Agnes stared into the fire now, watching the flames curl like ribbon, orange and blue. The light made her face seem softer, gentler than she ever let it appear in town. Her shawl slipped from one shoulder, but she didn't fix it. Just sat still, as if moving would break something she couldn't name. Silas sat across from her in the rocker, boots resting flat, hands on his knees. He didn't fidget. He never did. But she could tell from the slight grind of his jaw that something inside him was turning over. She wanted to ask 1,000 things. What if we lose? What happens after? Do I go? Do I stay? But the one question that rose from her chest surprised even her. Do you think, her voice caught, and she started again. Do you think God made me wrong? Silas's eyes lifted from the fire to her, steady and full of that quiet weight that never sought to impress, only to understand. He didn't answer right away. He let the words hang, settle, breathe. Then with that same low voice she'd only begun to hear in recent weeks, he said, God doesn't waste wood. He builds strong. She looked at him, and for a long moment, she didn't blink. Then something inside her, some brittle ancient shard, gave way. She let out a breath that trembled through her ribs and leaned her head gently against his shoulder. He didn't stiffen, didn't flinch. He just sat there with her, still as a tree, warm as the fire beside them. No more words were needed. Later, when the fire had burned down to coals and the silence grew soft around the edges, Agnes rose and stepped quietly to her cot. She reached into the space beneath it and pulled out her journal, worn now at the spine, the edges dark with ash and touch. She opened to a fresh page and wrote without pause, Tomorrow we face them, but tonight I am not afraid, not because I'm sure we'll win, but because I've already found something I didn't know I was missing, a place I don't have to shrink to fit, a man who sees without needing to stare, a fire that keeps burning, even when the wind tries to take it. She tore the page carefully from the binding, folded it once, and walked over to the small wooden box on the mantel, the one Silas had placed his unsent letters in all those years ago. She slid the page beside them, resting it there without ceremony. Then she returned to the bench, pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, and watched the last flame dance. Outside, the wind changed direction, and far down the mountain, the first light of morning began to reach. The church hall smelled of dust, wax, and old pine, a place meant for hymns and baptisms, not legal reckonings. But on that morning, the pews filled with townsfolk in stiff collars and tight mouths, their eyes darting between Agnes Harlow and the man seated beside her, and the clean-booted stranger who had stirred up so much noise with so little truth. Ezekiel Harlow sat smug at the front, flanked by his two witnesses. His coat was pressed, his mustache oiled, his posture straight as a poker, but his eyes were restless, shifting from face to face like a man who expected applause and instead found only stares. Agnes sat tall in the second row, her shoulders squared, hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore her mother's brooch, a simple brass locket pinned at the throat. Silas sat beside her, silent and unmoved, but not passive. He was stillness with a backbone. His presence alone felt louder than any voice in the room. The judge, a man with a furrowed brow and a reputation for honesty, cleared his throat and opened the proceedings. He welcomed the representatives, asked for the presentation of claims, and then leaned back to listen. Hattie Quinn stood first. She didn't speak fast or long, but every word landed with weight. I've known Miss Harlow since the day she set foot in Glory Mesa, she said, and I've known truth longer than that. She handed the clerk a stack of papers, burial records, witness statements, and one notarized affidavit from a traveling cattleman who had long ago sold his land rights to Silas Dorne. The land was never Ezekiel Harlow's to claim. Next came Caleb Boone, the blacksmith. He stepped up with dirt still under his nails and a roll of yellowed parchment in his thick hands. He laid it flat on the table and pointed to a faded signature. Surveyor's record, fencing done by me, paid by Dorne, documented in the year of our Lord, 1881. Ain't no forgery, and it ain't changed since. Ezekiel shifted in his chair. His smile was thinner now, eyes hardening. The judge turned to him. You have anything else to present, Mr. Harlow? Ezekiel stood, tried to summon charm, but his voice betrayed him. My claim rests on blood. Agnes Harlow is unstable. Everyone here knows it. She's large, loud, and manipulative. This isn't a matter of paperwork, Your Honor. It's about restoring order to— Enough, the judge said, lifting a hand. Then he turned to Silas. You have submitted a letter as evidence. Would you like it read aloud? Silas didn't move, just gave a slow, deliberate nod. The judge unfolded the yellowed page and began to read. The voice was flat, but the words were anything but. To whom it may concern, this land, every stone and blade of grass, was gifted to me and my husband Silas by God and promise. It was our home, our sanctuary. Should I pass, it remains his. This is my will in spirit, if not in law. Clara Dorne. The room went still, a hush deep enough to hear hearts beat. The judge folded the letter with care, set it down, and said plainly, This court finds the claims by Mr. Ezekiel Harlow to be false, filed in bad faith, and harmful in intent. The court fines Mr. Harlow $50 and recommends he return to his affairs elsewhere. The silence broke in murmurs, soft gas, the creak of pews, a few muttered prayers. Ezekiel's face blanched. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The deputy stepped forward. I'll see him out, Judge. As the doors closed behind Ezekiel and his lies, Silas stood, slowly. His boots met the floor like an oath being made. He turned, looked at Agnes, and nodded. It was the kind of nod a man gives when the truth has won, and when a promise has been kept, when the weight of silence is no longer burden, but bond. Agnes met his eyes, and for the first time in public, she smiled. Not a small smile, a full one, proud, free. The townsfolk didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They simply watched in reverent silence, as if witnessing something sacred, because they were. The morning sun poured down gentle across Glory Mesa, warming the dusty roadways and the wooden porches that lined Main Street. The air was crisp but forgiving, carrying with it the scent of horse sweat, wild sage, and fresh bread from the bakery 2 doors down from the chapel. It was the kind of morning that felt like a beginning, like something had shifted, even if the earth hadn't noticed. Agnes stepped carefully from the wagon with a basket of eggs in the crook of her arm. She wore her Sunday best apron, faded but freshly pressed, and her boots had been scrubbed clean of mud. Her braid, thick as a rope of wheat, hung down her back. At her side walked Silas Dorne, tall and silent as ever, her shawl draped carefully over one of his broad arms, just in case the wind picked up. His face held no expression, but his gait was slow, steady, sure. He matched her step for step. It wasn't their first trip into town, not technically, but it was the first time they'd come in broad daylight, side by side, heads high, no errands cloaked in necessity. No avoidance of crowds, just a walk that meant something. They passed the livery first. Young Tom paused mid-hammer swing to lift his cap in greeting. Agnes gave a nod, unsure at first how to return the gesture, until she caught the smile on his face. Not mocking, just warm. She smiled back, her grip on the basket tightening. As they turned toward the general store, silence stretched across the boardwalks. The clerk stood behind his barrels of dry goods, polishing a tin scoop. His eyes landed on Agnes, held there for a beat too long. Her shoulders tensed. Then slowly, he removed his cap and tipped it. Just once. A simple motion. Respectful. Agnes's throat closed. She nodded again, too quickly, blinking hard. She kept walking, her eyes on the road. The children were next. 2 girls and a boy, playing marbles near the feed store. The boy stood first, then the girls. For a moment they stared, wide-eyed, unsure. Then the smallest one, a girl with freckles across her nose, waved. "Morning, ma'am," she said, loud enough for all to hear. Agnes opened her mouth, but no words came. Her lips trembled. She raised one hand, waved back. And that's when it hit her. Not the gesture, not the courtesy, the welcome, the weight of being seen and not turned away, of standing in sunlight and not being whispered about from shadow, the unbearable relief of not having to explain her shape, her presence, her place beside a man who had chosen her not with words, but with steadiness. Tears came, hot, fast, uninvited. She stopped walking, pressed one hand to her cheek. The basket tilted, nearly spilling, but Silas caught it with one hand, righted it, and gently passed her the shawl. She took it with shaking fingers, pressing the fabric to her face as the tears spilled silently. Not from sadness, from something softer, heavier, from the sheer miracle of being known and not cast aside. Silas stood beside her, unmoving, letting her cry without shame. And Glory Mesa, for once, said nothing cruel. The town simply watched a woman weep and a man wait beside her, and knew, without question or mockery, that something good had finally come to stay. The thaw came early that year. Snow melted in lazy rivulets down the hillsides, pooling in the cracks of the pasture where grass had already begun to push through, soft and green. The air turned sweet, smelling of damp soil and waking things. Even the wind had a new tone to it, less like a howl, more like a whisper. Agnes noticed it first. She always did. She stood barefoot one morning, toes sinking into the warming dirt behind the barn, and said aloud to no one in particular, "It's time." Silas was splitting fence rails nearby, sleeves rolled, forehead glistening. He paused at her words, lifted his head slightly, and watched her step the length of the field with a measuring gaze. She turned in slow circles, arms crossed, already imagining rows. Her fingers twitched with the memory of planting, though it had been years since she'd had a patch of her own. Not since she was a girl, really, but the ache to grow something had never left. By afternoon, she had a spade in hand and dirt under her nails. She worked in quiet rhythm, marking lines, tilling earth, whispering names to herself, as if speaking the seeds into life. Tomatoes here, corn by the fence, sunflowers where the light touched longest. She hummed as she worked, not for others to hear, but because the ground seemed to like it. Silas built her a shed that same week. No instructions, no asking. Just did it. Hammer and nails, thick pine boards, a window facing east. When it was done, she stood before it with her hands on her hips and said, "It needs color." The next morning she appeared with a tin of blue paint and a brush. The color was bold, the kind of blue that made the sky jealous. By dusk, the little shed glowed in the sun like a hopeful prayer. Inside, she stored baskets, tools, and a small notebook where she wrote down what she planted and what it needed. Her handwriting was looping and strong, like everything else about her. The goats grew fat on spring grass, their bleats more contented than ever. One of them gave birth to twins, a rare surprise that had Agnes near tears, cradling the tiny creatures in her apron, while Silas watched, arms folded, that small smile curling at the edge of his mouth. They spoke more now, not in long speeches or confessions, but in the soft way people do when silence has already said the hardest parts. She'd say things like, "These sunflowers will grow taller than me," and he'd answer, "They'll have to try hard." Sometimes she laughed, really laughed, and when she did, Silas always looked up from whatever he was doing, as if her voice was something sacred he didn't want to miss. The past hadn't disappeared. It still lived in the lines on their faces, in the way Silas stared too long at the gravestone in the hill, or how Agnes sometimes woke in the night, gripping the edge of her blanket too tight. But it didn't rule them now. It had no vote in their days. What ruled them was the earth beneath their boots, the heat of the fire they shared, and the slow-growing peace of something planted deep, intended well. In the back pasture, green shoots poked through the soil, fragile, stubborn, alive. So were they. The girl came just after sunrise, walking slow along the dusty trail that led from Glory Mesa to the ranch. Her bonnet was too small for her round face, and her dress clung awkwardly at the seams. She held a slate board under one arm and a small bouquet of dandelions in the other, nervously picked and nervously carried. She stopped at the gate for a long time, staring toward the blue-painted shed behind the garden rows, where Agnes knelt tending the young corn. Agnes looked up and smiled without standing. "Well now," she said gently, brushing dirt from her palms. "You lost, or just early?" The girl swallowed hard. "My name's Maybelle. I'm not good at letters. Mama says I don't need 'em, but I want to. I heard you was kind. Heard you wrote things." Agnes didn't laugh. She only nodded and stood. "I do write things," she said, "and I think you do need them. You hungry?" Maybelle blinked. "A little. Then we'll start with biscuits and spelling." That was how it began. One girl, one morning, one quiet yes. They sat together on the porch, the slate balanced between them, Agnes shaping letters with soft explanations and patient hands. Maybelle struggled at first, frustrated by her fingers, too big for the delicate chalk, but Agnes didn't rush her. She offered practice, praise, and when Maybelle finally scratched out her name legibly, they both smiled like they'd won something holy. The next week, two boys from the livery came, pretending they just wanted to see the goats. But they lingered near the shed, eyes darting toward the slate, and Agnes, wise as ever, laid out a second and third board without comment. By the end of the month, there were 5 children, then 7. Some came barefoot, some with hands raw from chores, all of them hungry for more than food. They came for stories, for numbers, for the way Agnes made them feel seen without judgment. She never raised her voice, never made them feel small. Silas noticed the crowd growing. One evening after supper, he walked to the shed, measured the space in silence, and the next morning began building benches, sturdy ones made of smooth pine and thick nails, each one wide enough for any child to sit comfortably, no matter how narrow the world had once made them feel. Hattie arrived the following week with a crate full of worn books, her smile tired but proud. "Was saving these," she said, "for something worth the saving." The schoolhouse grew not in size but in spirit. The blue shed rang with laughter, questions, and the scratch of chalk on slate. A painted sign, "Learning Place," hung over the door, crooked but earnest. The townsfolk, once silent with suspicion, now brought baskets of apples, extra pencils, and on Sundays, pies. What had once been a ranch cloaked in grief became a place of beginnings, of wonder, of second chances. And every afternoon when the last child skipped home, Agnes stood by the garden with her journal tucked under her arm, watching the sun settle over the hills. Silas would come to stand beside her, quiet as always, and together they'd watch the earth they'd both once thought barren come alive with bloom and laughter. She didn't say it aloud, but she thought it every time. This land used to bury pain. Now it grows futures. The sky was the color of warm ash when Agnes sat down at the little table by the window. Outside, the last of the children were kicking dust on the road home, their laughter still clinging to the air like birdsong. The blue shed stood steady against the early evening light, its door ajar, a chalkboard leaning just inside, covered in half-finished sentences and crooked drawings. The garden beyond it had begun to green again after a week of spring rain, and sunflowers were already tall enough to cast long shadows. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, more for comfort than for heat. Silas was in the barn tending to a mule's hoof. He'd said nothing as usual when he'd gone, just gave her that familiar glance, the one that asked no questions and offered all the time in the world. Agnes opened her journal, the worn leather soft beneath her fingers. She'd filled nearly every page now, some with sketches of goats, others with names of children and their favorite books. She'd written prayers, memories, recipes, even a poem or two she never read aloud. But tonight she pulled a fresh sheet from the back, thicker than the rest, and dipped her pen with a care she reserved for only the most sacred things. At the top she wrote, "To me." Then she paused, let the silence gather around her, and began. "You are not broken. You were never too much, or too wide, or too loud. They just didn't know how to carry the shape of you. That was never your fault. You kept walking when no one walked beside you. You kept singing when no one clapped. You mended other people's torn things even when your own seams were splitting. That is strength. Not the loud kind, not the kind that swings a hammer, but the quiet kind that builds homes where no one thought anything could grow. You learned to hold space, not just for others, but for yourself. You planted sunflowers in ground that once only held sorrow. You opened a door and let in a girl who reminded you of yourself, and you gave her something you didn't have once, a soft place to land. And look at you now. You are still big, still bold, still shaped by the wind and the work, but you are no longer alone. You are no longer waiting for someone to give you permission to belong. You do belong, here, now, always. She let the ink dry in the quiet. The fire had dimmed to amber coals. She folded the letter once, twice with slow, deliberate hands, then rose. The wooden box still sat on the mantel, unchanged since the first day she'd found it. Inside were Silas's letters, some yellowed, some still sharp with the creases of unsent grief. She opened the lid, placed her folded page gently among them, and closed it. Not to be hidden, not to be forgotten, but to be remembered. She stood there a moment longer, letting her palm rest on the wood. Then she turned back toward the window. The sky had deepened to violet, and Silas was walking back from the barn, his steps steady, his silhouette familiar as breath. She smiled. The letter was written, the story still unfolding. Dusk came with a hush that wrapped the hills in gold. Soft and forgiving, the long shadows of the porch posts stretched across the packed dirt like reaching arms, and the wind that drifted through the valley carried the sweet, familiar scent of lilac from the bushes blooming behind the blue-painted shed. It was the kind of evening that settled into the bones, quiet, certain, eternal. Silas sat in his usual place on the porch, a small block of cedar in his hands, his blade working slow and careful. He wasn't carving anything in particular. He never did, just shapes that felt good to make, curves and edges, something to turn wood into memory. The children's voices drifted up from the grass, a gentle murmur like water over stones, and his hand paused just long enough for him to listen. Agnes sat on a blanket in the grass, cross-legged, her boots kicked off and set neatly beside her. A worn book rested in her lap, open to the middle. Around her a ring of children sat or lay on their bellies, faces lifted, eyes wide. Some were from the town, sons of merchants, daughters of blacksmiths. Some were wanderers like she had been, children who had arrived with little more than a name and a look of not quite knowing where they belonged. All of them listened as if the story she read was written just for them. Her voice, steady and warm, carried over the pasture with a rhythm that turned pages into magic. And when the giant woman reached the end of the path, she found not a gate to turn her away, but a table set for two and a chair strong enough to hold all of her. The children giggled softly. One of the girls, Maybelle, leaned against Agnes's arm and whispered, "Is that story about you?" Agnes smiled but didn't answer right away. She looked up instead, toward the sky above Glory Mesa, where the last light was bleeding out in soft streaks of rose and blue. The stars would come soon, but for now the sky was wide open, like a breath held and finally released. She glanced toward the porch. Silas was watching her. The cedar block paused in his hands. He didn't smile, not fully, but his eyes said enough. They always had. She closed the book gently and looked at the children around her. Maybe it's about all of us, she said, about finding a place where you don't have to get smaller to stay. They didn't ask what she meant. They just nodded, like somehow they already knew. Down the hill, the lights in town blinked to life, soft lantern glow through windows and doorways. No one whispered anymore. Not about the woman who'd been called too much, not about the man who never spoke. The stories had changed, grown gentler. Truth had rooted itself in the soil, just like the corn, just like the sunflowers. Agnes rose, brushing grass from her skirt, and walked barefoot back toward the porch, children trailing behind her like petals caught in a breeze. Silas stood as she reached the top step and handed her the cedar carving without a word. She turned it over in her hand, a sunflower, simple and perfect. She pressed it to her chest and nodded, the same slow nod he'd once given her in the church hall when everything had been uncertain. Above them, the sky stretched wide and quiet and full, and everything below it was finally at peace.